Welcome back, everybody, to episode number 13 of the Untangling Election 2021 podcast, your semi-weekly podcast covering the Canadian federal election of 2021. This week, we're looking at Erin O'Toole and the Conservative Party as perhaps the party that's made the most gains and the most visible gains within the Canadian political race this time around. There's some questions about him, and there's some questions about the Conservative Party in general. As a key newcomer to the 2021 election, if Canadians were asked their opinion of O'Toole before the summer, many would have answered, who? Despite this, O'Toole is now head-to-head with Trudeau in the polls, with a potential O'Toole prime ministership on the horizon. Perhaps now is a good time to look at what we can learn about him from his campaigns. Is his success due to his leadership or his campaign? What lessons should a Conservative Party take from the campaign so far? Joining me today is, I think, a keen listener from the podcast from what I've heard. Tony, tell us about yourself, Tony.
Hey, everyone. My name is Tony Stevens. I'm a 29-year-old graduate of the University of Waterloo, system design engineering. I currently work for an insurance company doing IT locally here in KW. And I've been married for 2 years to my lovely wife, Claire, who is actually Ryan's brother. So for those of you who are faithful listeners like myself, Ryan was one of the original guests on the show, and he introduced me to it. So yeah, I really enjoy it. We live in Elmira, so the Kitchener-Conestoga riding, in our newly purchased house with our Black Lab Guinness.
That flex of a newly purchased house is not the best thing to say in this election about housing, right?
Yeah, I guess I say it to give me some credibility that I have been in the struggle of getting a house, but yeah, we've kind of conquered that hurdle, so I have to be careful what I say about it.
Nah, no worries. It's an aspiration we're all aiming to get one day, and it's really reflective in this election. Talking about this election, tell us a bit about where you lean in elections. Who are you as a political person or a political, I wouldn't say figure, but political enthusiast?
Yeah. When it comes to my political voting and biases, I have always been strongly conservative. I grew up in a rural background. I've been a lifelong conservative voter. I have been a member of the Federal Conservative Party. I voted in the last 2 leaders' elections. I will admit Erin O'Toole was not my first choice, but I am much happier with his leadership than potentially some of the others that were in the docket. It's also worth mentioning that I am a lifelong Christian and am heavily involved in my church for most of my life. So I have a view that politics and religion are 2 separate spheres. But if you hear me talk about politics for long enough, it will probably, some points that sound a bit religious or believing will come up. And it is because my personal beliefs affect how I vote and what I want to see.
Yeah, no, it's always interesting, I think, how who we are as individuals and how we're raised kind of affects, I guess, these choices we make later in our lives. I mean, I feel like sometimes a ballot cast doesn't seem like that big of a choice, but it's very indicative of where your personal leanings lie, right?
Yeah, because I think what I was taught thinking about politics growing up was that behind every policy is a person that it affects, either positively or negatively. So sometimes as a voter, I try to go beyond the policy and see what is the person behind it and how is this going to affect them. And that can be really hard sometimes sitting in southwestern Ontario and trying to think about what's best for Northern, what's best for Atlantic, what's best for the West.
Yeah, I do think voting, as much as we take it as something we just have, it is very much a privilege, a right that's very meaningful. What are your thoughts so far in this election? Because I know you're new to the podcast. I try to ask everybody who comes new on the podcast, what do you think the election so far?
Yeah, I would say day one, I was super happy with the Conservative Party. When they dropped that plan, they looked like they were ready to go 0 to 100 in the first day. And I felt like, we'll obviously talk about this more, but some of the topics that they chose to address right on day one, regardless of how exactly they matched with my views, they were just so deliberate about, these are what the issues are, these are what have had issues in the past with, so we're just going to address them and talk about them. And then obviously as September wore on, the polls looked really good for the Conservatives. They were, according to CBC Poll Tracker, they were slated to have a super high percentage of getting government. Obviously that started to slide a little bit, and you've talked about that in past podcasts. I still have a lot of hope. I think that people are looking for an alternative to Trudeau. And I think Erin O'Toole has done a miraculous job of presenting himself as an alternative, and not just an alternative, but the clear, the precise, the calculated alternative, readdress issues, or yeah. So that's the only other thing I would say. It's kind of silly that there was only one English debate.
Well, I'm not sad about it because it's a lot of work for me to edit these episodes at like midnight. So, nah,
Yes.
I joke. I would have loved to see more debates too. They're the pinnacle of every election.
Mm-hmm.
But going more to the meat of this podcast, we're going to look a bit at what our expectations for the Conservatives were and how that's kind of aligned or not aligned with their performance now. And with all of these parties, of all of this political stuff, it starts months in advance, and it starts a long time beforehand. I think candidates declared a candidacy like back in like January. I saw some people do, so it's a long process. And I wanted to start by asking you, Tony, because you're always a Conservative supporter, from what I've gathered so far.
Yes.
If I asked you in July, what issues should the Conservatives be campaigning on, what would you have said?
So I would have definitely said housing would have been a quick and easy one that came to mind. Living in KW, right close by Toronto, two of the most volatile housing markets. I have friends in Ottawa that I know of. So like housing has to be a discussion. And then I think the next two that would have immediately come to mind are climate change, simply because even if the Conservatives weren't going to address it the same as the other parties, they needed to talk about it. And then finally, of course, COVID. But I would say I'm happy in how COVID has been discussed. I feel like it hasn't been a line of attack too much for them on Trudeau. And I think that's smart. So those were the three issues if you had asked me in July. And then potentially inflation, dealing with rising cost of living. I'm not an economist, but I know my gas prices are going up, and I think a lot of people have noticed. And that's just kind of one of the key indicators that everything is becoming a little more expensive. So, and then with that, budget. Conservatives always talk about budget. I love it.
I feel like budget has been more absent this year than any other campaign I've seen before. So I kind
Yes.
of want to ask you more broadly, how do you think your predictions would have sufficed? Do you think that these issues that you would have predicted in July, have they been present in the Conservative campaign? Why or why not?
Yeah. I was very surprised initially that the Conservatives did not go for the strong balance the budget line. That has been almost a staple of Conservative campaigns for many years, and I think it serves them well. It's a simple enough policy. So on one hand, I was really surprised, but I like the more people I talk to, the more I do believe that people smarter than me are saying we need to spend in some ways to get out of this economic slump, to get through the pandemic. And you look at every first world country, there's a lot of spending going on. So I think the Conservatives have taken a very careful approach to not letting spending run out of control in their plan, but not saying they're going to balance the budget in 1 year or 2 years, because I think that would just be unfeasible.
Mm-hmm. We've talked a little about the issues. I don't want to linger on them too far because I think we want to get into more of the campaigns and Erin O'Toole's performance. So
Yeah.
I believe you mentioned you voted both the leadership races. So I wanted to ask you, what were your first thoughts of O'Toole when he was like running and finally elected? What did you think of the man then?
I think he was a bit of the safe choice. So if you look at the four people in the 2019 leadership race that really made the distance, it was Leslyn Lewis, Derek Sloan, Peter MacKay, and Erin O'Toole. And Derek Sloan garnered a lot of support, but was never really projected to win. And then you had Leslyn Lewis, who I would say was a social conservative, Peter MacKay, who is probably the most like a fairly red establishment Tory, had been in government for a very long time, but hadn't necessarily garnered a lot of popular support. I think Erin O'Toole is very much the safe choice and maybe the second tick for a lot of people. Like I myself, I feel confident saying I voted Leslyn first, Erin O'Toole second. And I think that's what happened with a lot of people when their first options of maybe Sloan or Leslyn Lewis didn't work out. Their second ballot was Erin O'Toole because he wasn't as establishment as Peter MacKay. And I think I was encouraged by his military service, his past postings, some of his caring for different communities in that. And I think he put on that face better than I saw Peter MacKay do it. So not my first choice, but definitely happier with him and thought he could help guide the party.
I mean, it does sound kind of stereotypical that the Conservatives are voting their boring second choice and make that their leader, right?
It is, but again, I don't think that's a weakness of the party
Yeah.
because he will talk about the PPC, but he has managed to hold together a divided West, make some inroads into Atlantic Canada, which has been some of the surprise of this election. And he has a strong Ontario presence. And even BC, we're seeing, I think the Liberals and the Conservatives are neck and neck in polling there. So as far as a unity leader, I think he did a really good job for holding together a lot of elements that look to be splitting apart. And he managed to pull them together in the face of a lot of provinces having conservative or non-conservative governments that people were unhappy with. Like recently in the news, Ontario conservatives and I think Alberta conservatives provincially are not super loved. So he didn't have it easy in those provinces, championing the conservative mandate.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's because I'm getting older myself, but I've been feeling that the more recent years, people in Canada seem to understand more that there's a division between provincial parties and federal parties. I think I've really been noticing that. I don't know if it's maybe just me noticing that more as I've grown older and become more aware of the political scene, but I do feel like people notice a distinct division between what Doug Ford says and what O'Toole stands for.
I think some of it is realized by the pandemic because people came to the realization that health is actually a provincial issue.
Hmm.
And when they thought that Justin Trudeau was going to be making the decisions for each individual province, they very quickly realized that it was the provincial governments and their health ministers that were actually making a lot of the day to day and week to week decisions about COVID. So I feel like that's opened people's eyes to what provincial and federal authority really stands.
Yeah, because it always feels more like a footnote from civics class. But I think one of the, I guess, silver linings, if I can call it, from the pandemic might have been seeing how that is actually illustrated, as you were saying. That's a good point. Moving a bit more to the campaign itself, I want to linger a little on how O'Toole has been as a candidate, right? So one of the surprises, to be blunt, has been how competent a conservative campaign has been under O'Toole. And I know it sounds weird to say that, but we've always seen the conservatives fumbling with something or another.
Mm-hmm.
However, there has been a few slip-ups here or there in the O'Toole campaign, and I'll list out a few of them, a few of the highlights, I guess, or lowlights in your eyes. And I want you to kind of respond to kind of why you think there've been slip-ups or kind of what they mean for the campaign. So I think the bigger ones are swing voters being concerned about if O'Toole can actually control his MPs and really handle his crowd on issues such as climate, where we've seen significant divides between what O'Toole's opinion has been and his MP's opinion in past leadership elections and stuff like that. Moreover, we've also seen the weird issue of gun rights being brought up, and I thought that was O'Toole's weakest point, where he kind of flip-flopped, and a lot of critics really nipped at his heels about that, although it wasn't that big of a sticking point in the debate, so I think he should have thanked
Yeah.
God for that. And finally, there was this breaking story this week, and I don't know how significant this will be, but just the labor union voices were all coming out against O'Toole and basically saying anybody but conservative, which is interesting considering how much the conservative plan focused on jobs. But I can see you smiling, Tony. What do you think about all these criticisms leveled at the conservatives? What do they really mean? What do they signify?
Yeah, I think as a conservative supporter, a long-term conservative supporter, some of these are very familiar. I think the swing voters, so worried about O'Toole controlling the more radical aspects of his party, that is a valid criticism, but I would remind people the conservatives have suffered a split this election to hold to their position. Like there is literally another conservative party this election because O'Toole didn't monolithically rein in everyone, but stuck to his guns. And the party, is addressing climate change. Maybe not in the way everyone would like, but they are addressing it. And they are, O'Toole is pro-choice, and people don't like that, but O'Toole's sticking with it. So I would say that O'Toole, at the cost of votes and some support, has maintained party control. but not monolithic. And I guess I always appreciate that about the Conservatives, that when it comes to issues, there is a party unity, but there is also freedom to put forward things like private member bills on social issues. So that would be my response to that, is the Conservatives are not monolithic. I agree, but they have set limits of what they're doing this campaign, and people have left because of it, and they're not courting those people wholesale to try to bring them back. I would agree with you that the swing on gun rights was one of O'Toole's weaker moments. In a campaign where they looked so prepared on every issue and had been thinking about it for months, there should have been someone in a room having a discussion about what's our position on these, not even new legislation, on bills that are already passed. So it's already law. They should have known what their position was on it and stuck to it, because the flip-flopping does make you look weak, and I think it makes you look weak on an issue that is not worth the negative press on. Like, I don't care about gun freedom that much, I'm going to be honest. I lean more towards gun control. So to see us taking a hit because of that, I'm like, that could have been avoided. And then I think the last thing I would say is labor unions don't ever love conservatives. Like, I remember, like, there was a controversy, I believe, last federal election where there were some small lines crossed by some teachers and police unions and political ads that were put out that were not in favor of conservatives. And I think it just comes with the territory. We love the workers, the unions don't love us. And I think reading the nuts and details of O'Toole's plan, it's usually focused on individual workers and then not as much unions.
What do you think then of like the grand scope of these critiques? Because they haven't been that killer, I guess. Do you think there's any trends or things you want to maybe comment on? Is there any final observations, I guess, on his pitfalls?
Yeah, I think, and without a specific source of these criticisms, like a specific article or that, I think sometimes there is a general tendency that the left is stronger in media, and the left has a tendency to focus on the fringe elements of the conservative or the most negative elements without focusing on the equally fringe or negative elements of the left parties. Like, there are some very interesting policies and people in the Liberals and the NDPs and the Greens. And I respect the fact that being a Liberal is not represented by your worst member. And I would hope that the same courtesy is extended, that being a Conservative is not represented by our worst or maybe most far-right member. And then there's also a tendency that there's a much larger discussion that really there is this arc in kind of media and society that until conservatives become liberals, there's always going to be something wrong with them. And I think that's more of a conversation about national unity and the growing, I would say, divide between older traditional values and newer values. So I think that's always going to exist. And I read more right publications, and I disagree with some of the criticisms they level at the liberals and conservatives. They're very hacky and rhetorical or straw man. So I think both parties could do well to recognize that they're probably never going to agree on anything, or not never going to agree on anything, never going to agree on everything, and kind of accept that conservatives will always be a little bit conservative and liberals will always be a little bit liberal.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me more of back, I think, in the 1950s and 60s, when the liberals and conservatives were alternating between power. When they used to go on foreign trips, they would take along an opposition MP just to kind of show that diverse opinion. So on like a liberal mission abroad, they would take a conservative MP just to have that other voice in the room. And I kind of miss that kind of cooperation between party lines going on nowadays. I know our big brother in America is a lot more polar than us, but
yeah,
I can see some of it seeping through to the Canadian dialogue, and I think it's very sad. It could have been better.
Yeah, and I think elections should be when, as a nation, we discuss and we come together to hear all the viewpoints on a topic. Like, I realize that I do not have all the information, and that there are things that liberals are better at doing than my own party. And so I would never want a government that's monolithically conservative, just like I'd never want a government that's monolithically liberal. I like the Canadian system of compromise and working together and the necessity of that.
Yeah, and I guess pivoting a bit back to what we were talking about O'Toole's campaign, O'Toole, as you were
Mm-hmm.
saying, has made a lot of compromises and worked together with a lot of people in his party to kind of been able to present a pretty strong set of beliefs himself. So, like you mentioned, he's a pro-life. He's managed to set forth a really strong opinion on vaccination, which surprised many pundits, I might add. And he's
Yes.
also been running, I guess, a COVID-safe campaign. His platform was released on time or was actually existent compared to 2019. So he avoided many of the pitfalls of yesteryear and he's looked stable. So I guess all in all, how do you rate this campaign by O'Toole?
I would rate it quite high. I think O'Toole and the Conservatives were again, as I said before, they were ready to go and they had a plan to deal with the Liberals and the NDP. In our talk beforehand, we talked about how in the Conservative platform, there are some very direct call outs to NDP policies. And midway through the campaign, they had a significant lead. And I think it was because their plan was working. They were wearing down at Trudeau and the NDP. They were presenting themselves as a viable alternative. O'Toole was keeping a steady pace of events with no serious downfalls. I think the poorest campaign aspect, and maybe the part they were the most unprepared for, is the PPC. And I think over the past couple days in this short election, we've really seen that become a larger issue than maybe people thought it was going to be. The percentage of, at least right now, people that are polling for the PPC.
Yeah, we'll get to there in a really quick second. But I quickly want to
Mm-hmm.
ask, because this sprung to my mind, is well, you're attributing a lot of success to the Conservatives' preparedness, which I would hope so. That's part of their slogan, pretty much. The man with a
Yes.
plan, right? But I also want to maybe run by you, is this maybe a bit of the Liberals not being prepared for this election that kind of caused O'Toole to do so well? So if we look maybe perhaps the Liberals delaying releasing their platform, the Liberals not having anything exciting within their platform, the Liberals not being able to escape the rhetoric of them calling the election during a pandemic, because those all really bog down the polls too, some might say. Would you maybe concede that it's liberal incompetence, if I can word it that strongly, which caused more of the conservative rise, or is it just conservative ingenuity?
No, I would definitely, I would, yeah, definitely say that liberal incompetence, as we're calling it, was part of the reasoning. Like they had the advantage. They did not lose a majority. Like they did not lose a budget vote. They did not lose a speech from the throne. They called the election, and I think conservatives. The initial incompetence went to the Liberals, not releasing a platform, not really getting off to a running start. But I'm impressed with the Conservatives capitalizing on it, but in meaningful ways.
Hmm.
O'Toole has resorted to a little more, punching directly at Trudeau these past couple of days, and I'd say this week. But early in the campaign, they talked about their plan, they talked about their ideas, and didn't let Justin Trudeau and the Liberals decide the campaign agenda.
Yeah, that's a good point. Wrapping up this segment, I just want to know, even if O'Toole fails to form government, what will be your key takeaways from this campaign? What should the Conservatives keep and change in 2022 when we inevitably have another election?
I think that I think the big thing they should keep is O'Toole as a leader.
Hmm.
I don't think the Conservatives right now need another leadership race and another party restructure. And I think some of the primary things O'Toole has done and issues he has addressed should continue forward. There was a interesting poll released by the Innovation Research Group that talked about how people view party governance on issues, and the three lowest issues that people trust the Conservatives to govern on are climate change, gun violence, and women's rights. So if I think the takeaways are that climate change, I feel like we did a really good job this election. I think those other two follow a similar strategy. Don't copy and paste the Liberal platform. Don't try to conform to that. But show that you are serious about these issues. Show that you have a plan that's beyond just what maybe the conservative one-liners were. And I think especially for gun violence, as we talked about, the flip-flopping on gun legislation has not helped them. So
Hmm.
keep what you did with your campaign platform and the detailedness of it. Keep what you did with climate change, promoting your solutions, not no solution, but expand that to the other categories that you're seeing as untrustworthy.
Yeah, I think those are some good takeaways. I I'm interested to see what the results will be, and I'll ask you
Hmm.
for your predictions later on. But I think it's really the conservative performance here has really surprised me, and I think they've come out looking much better than I expected they would have from this election. So,
Hmm.
but talking about conservative support, well, we've been riding a bit on the high of last week, this week, and a little bit of the end of last week too. We've seen their support slip a bit. We've seen that some of their gains aren't really falling, but beginning to stall, and have again leveled right now with the Liberals in most major polls, and it's basically statistical deadlock. Why do you think this kind of
Hmm.
happened?
Yeah, I would say I have to attribute it to two things, but the primary thing I would say is the PPC. I think so if you look at CBC poll tracker right now, they're polling at about 6.6% nationally. If you even have that percentage, so 3.3, and say all of those people poll for the Conservatives, which is not an unreasonable guess, that puts us back at like early September numbers and potentially even better. And also looking at CBC poll tracker, the main losses of Conservative supporters to PPC are in Ontario and Atlantic Canada, two regions that we needed voters to come out for. Those are already troublesome regions for the Conservatives already. And if you look at areas we're wanting to win, Southwestern Ontario, the 905 region, the PPC vote that goes there is particularly damaging. In my own riding of Kitchener-Conestoga, the last election, we had a really an amazing candidate, Harold Albrecht, one of my favorite
Hmm.
conservatives by far. And he lost. He was in a tight race with Tim Lewis, so he wasn't like pulling strong, but he was in a tight race. And the percentage of not even the percentage, the exact amount he lost by is the votes that went to the PPC. And there are tons of ridings like that where we see close conservative races falling because of, in part, PPC support. So that'd be one thing. I would say the second point I would say is that I think Trudeau has stepped up as the election went on. I have to give him the credit. He is a seasoned campaigner. He knows how to play the social issues. He knows how to play the long game because it would have been easy for them to scramble and to try to match the conservatives exactly, but they waited, they released their platform, and they've seemed to recover. And this is might be the most frustrated I sound the whole podcast. I do not understand how nothing seems to stick to Trudeau. Nothing. Like none of his scandals, his weird comments, his seemingly aggressive comments about vaccinated people or sorry, unvaccinated people. Recently, there was a story that broke where he criticized a reporter for not asking him racial or social justice questions in an interview. And I just don't understand how these don't hurt his image a little more. But he obviously knows what works.
Just kind of responding to that bafflement
Yeah.
of yours, I feel like it's kind of like maybe because I am a man, a straight white man. Trudeau is kind of like the person we want to be, right? Good looking,
Ah.
50, with a family, respected, leader of a country, somewhat wealthy, you might say. He kind of embodies a lot of the good characteristics, and we don't want to see somebody's good image of herself being slandered. I know for some people it's already
Mm.
down to mud, but even the last remaining supporters, he's some kind of mythical beast, right? It'll take a lot more to kind of ruin that image forever.
And for those who haven't listened to this episode yet, it's really interesting in the one where you talk about Trudeau's image and that Trudeau's international image is almost impeccable. And
Mm-hmm.
I think you have a good point there. Canadians love that our prime minister is kind of a superstar. Like
Yeah.
even a little bit of me as a conservative supporter love that Canada is getting sometimes more of a platform on the world stage, and it is in large part because of Trudeau. So that also, I agree with you, makes it hard for things to stick to him.
Yeah, because I know technically O'Toole is younger and, hipper and cooler as they want us to believe. But if O'Toole shows up to the next G20, people aren't going to be, he's not going to make like Us Weekly or whatever.
No, definitely not. He tried that with his cover photo of the conservative platform, and it worked, but it didn't. Nothing like Trudeau's
It worked to
image.
make discussion. It didn't work to make GQ.
Of, of course.
we were talking a bit about the PPC, and I really wanted to do an episode dedicated solely to PPC, but it is a bit difficult finding a rational PPC supporter to have on. So if you know any, please link me up. I would love to do a PPC episode with a PPC supporter, kind of know how they view these issues going around. But I guess for the time being, I just want to ask you, because you're a bit, I guess I would say you lean more right than I do and many other people I have in this podcast.
For sure.
So I kind of want to pick your brain on what you think about the PPC.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest. This is a difficult question for me for a couple of reasons. I do feel very strongly about the PPC, both positive and negative. And some of it is because, I know, I'm going to share this podcast when it's done. And I know there are going to be people listening to it who are in my friends and my church community that are strong PPC supporters. So I'm balancing valuing and respecting them, but also I do have strong views about the PPC. I think, to put it simply, I don't agree with the manner or position taken by the PPC on a lot of issues. However, I very much sympathize with their concern and some of their emotion about these issues. So I've written out, looking at the PPC platform, these are issues that I understand their concern over. I just don't agree with the measures that they're proposing to put forward. So, for example, I myself am vaccinated, but I am very unhappy with Ontario legislation concerning vaccination certificate and the barring of people from areas. I've written to my MPPs about it. So it's a very real issue for people who are unvaccinated, and I get that. My wife and I had a lot of troubles finding a house that was in our affordability range, and I know friends who have been looking for much longer than us. But I disagree with PPC notions of reducing immigration to cool the housing market or defunding social housing programs. I don't think that's the measures needed. I want fiscal responsibility and budget balancing, but not at the cost of many Canadians' welfare or by wholesale slashing social programs. And then, the last one that I don't even get why it's on the PPC platform, I disagree with repealing the Multiculturalism Act and eliminating funding to promote multiculturalism. I don't agree with every part of that, and I love our Canadian identity, but I just don't understand that. So when I talk with PPC supporters, I can often understand what they're feeling and want these issues to be addressed in real ways. But when it comes to what they're actually voting for, and this is straight from the PPC website, that's just not where I'm at.
Those are some good points. And I think I know coming back to Canada during the pandemic and just seeing how it's changed, I know a lot of emphasis on the community we have around us. And I think that even the more deepening divisions between people, especially on political, is only going to stress the communities we have and are so important now. So I think it's very important to handle these questions very tactfully. But I do think it's important to also say, this is where I stand. I appreciate that you're coming at it from some way. It makes philosophically sense, which I agree with on a large part too, because I think, banning people from going to eat in a restaurant, that doesn't seem to really align with a lot of our rights and freedoms in some aspects. So there are legitimate concerns, and if the main parties aren't voicing it, there should be a voice for these concerns. However, the manner that voice is voicing these concerns, if I'm not overusing the word voice, might be a bit overwhelming.
I think I want to interject one point that I didn't think of until now, so it's not in my notes. I think one area the Conservatives have not been strong on is detailing what their COVID-19 and vaccination policy are. I've personally emailed my candidate in Kitchener-Conestoga, and she has affirmed to me that the Conservatives are not going to require mandatory vaccinations for anything but international travel because that's required by other countries. And a part of me goes, why is not policy like that or decisions like that being more disseminated to maybe encourage people that Conservatives are taking a different stance on this? I do appreciate that O'Toole has followed all the COVID protocols of every province he's been in. I am a strong supporter of vaccination. That is a whole nother discussion, but I appreciate his stances on that. But I also appreciate that they're not mandating as much as other provinces are or other parties are proposing.
Yeah, it's a good point, because it is, you'd think that something like that would be really easily findable on a Conservative platform. And as a seasoned reader of these massive 100-page Conservative platforms, you should be able to point it out to me, but If you have to email your MP about it, that doesn't seem like good optics. I
Mm-hmm.
guess cycling back around a little to the PPC, I kind of personally approve of the idea of the PPC existing. I know many people think that they shouldn't be in a Canadian political landscape. I disagree. I think if there is a need for a voice like that, then there should be a voice like that representing the people. After all, it is politics. The core is the people themselves. They need to be represented
Agreed.
somehow. And what my pet theory is that and maybe others have had this theory too, I've heard it floating around, is that the PPC is drawing more of the extremist voices outside the PC party, the Progressive Conservative Party. And that, I believe, is overall net positive for the Progressive Conservative Party, where it kind of creates more unity within the party, which has seen enough leadership races for our lifetimes in the last few years. Any thoughts on
Yeah.
that, or is that a very, I guess, loaded question?
Yeah. I think that I 100% agree that having a voice to represent all aspects of Canadians is healthy. It's healthy
Mm-hmm.
to national discussion. It's healthy to unity. I've never opposed or been against parties like the Green Party or the Bloc Québécois, even if they seem to represent a smaller subset of people. I think they bring value to our politics and our identity, even if I don't agree with them. Democracy is also always compromised. So you should always have a meet in the middle of some sort. That being said, I think personally as a conservative voter, I don't love the trend of people getting attracted to the PPC maybe over one or two issues and then radicalized is too strong of a word, but becoming more extreme because of the atmosphere they're in. I think that there's more value to a party where you have to confront views that are different than yours and you have to have nuanced discussions to arrive at what your platform is. So I think it makes party unity easier, but I don't know if it's actually healthy, especially for some of the people and groups that are getting caught up in it. I think when it comes to things like some conspiracy theories that are floating around or what I'll call aggressive political behavior or isolation of, from media or alternate news points, I don't think that's healthy. So I think if the PPC party grows into maybe something we saw back in the 90s where you had the Reform Party and the progressive conservatives, yes, that would be healthy. And I think that would be a new part of Canadian politics. I don't see them like that right now. I see a lot more behavior and tendencies that I don't think are positive for the individuals involved or for the Canadian political landscape.
Yeah, I like how you bring up the split in the 90s because that's personally, and no, I'm not a conservative voter whatsoever. I'm neutral. I have no stake in this election. I would like to see the right-wing landscape have a more diverse set of parties, much like the left has the NDP and Liberals to kind of represent themselves. I would like to see that the right also goes back to having the progressive conservatives for the red Tories, maybe the Reform Party for the most SOCON leaning people. I think that's a better way of structuring the system, but that's neither here nor
Yeah.
there. Um, we'll see what happens, and that's why I've been saying I think it's important to talk about conservatives now because it'll really set out how this party will look for the next decade. This election right now we're in, I think it's very
Mm-hmm.
important. And I think one of the small outcomes that we can predict already from this election is that I think the PPC is being validated as a part of the Canadian political landscape. I think it was not too outrageous when they made the claim earlier this month of excluding the PPC from the debates. But if this were to happen next year, if there were to be another election, I think it would be outrageous then because they're right now polling 6.6% of popular vote, which is higher than the Green Party got in 2019 after the election. So yeah, I think the PPC, as much as we are hesitant, though supportive somewhat, I guess if we could say that,
Yeah.
it's here to stay, I guess. Even though I don't
Mm-hmm.
think they'll win a seat.
Yeah. I agree with you on a lot of things. I think they need to be invited into the dialogue, and I don't like some of the tendency to try to cancel the PPC that has occurred.
Mm.
So I agree with that. I sympathize with the debate moderators not including the PPC, but I think they should have foreseen and that it, yeah. So for sure next time. Though personally, this is completely a personal opinion. I think that the PPC will decline in popularity if there is an election without COVID, because I think the issue of vaccinations and vaccine certificates has become a gathering ground for the PPC. Whereas before, you didn't see a single, maybe pro-life, you didn't see a single issue in the conservative platform that there was such a split on, or it was a geographical split like east-west, which the conservatives have always had to deal with. So I'm curious if COVID starts to fade in 2022 or it becomes stabilized, if that will lead to a decline.
It's a good point you mentioned. I did want to respond to this because
Yes.
the issue with the PPC is they're very new, right? And they are new, but looking at, like, for instance, I was in the Netherlands earlier this year, and they had an election as well, and they also had some more extremist right-wing leaning parties, which kind of mirrored the PPC's beliefs. And they existed for longer than the PPC. But before this election, they weren't specifically anti-COVID because COVID didn't exist. They tended to be anti-immigrant. They tended to leech onto some other popular issue in the zeitgeist and make that their anti-issue, which everybody can flock towards. And we kind of saw in 2019, the PPC emerged as more of an anti-immigrant party than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
I would venture out to say. And my prediction is when COVID declines, they'll find some other niche issue in the Canadian zeitgeist to leech onto and make that the defining issue of the party. They'll kind of propagate that way. They'll continue to be this kind of voice in the bleachers, I guess, if the saying is.
Yeah.
They'll continue to find things to kind of propel themselves forward, although it's much more moving with the times. I don't know if you think that's a possibility, but
I think that's a really interesting discussion. And I agree. I think for sure the leadership of the PPC will try to find that singular issue to pull people into. I just don't know if one exists in the Canadian psyche. Because if we look at issues, even I would say touchpoint issues like abortion or immigration, Canadians are actually much more in agreement over the generals of those than they are. Like party, the major party platforms, none of them are significant reductions in immigration. And generally Canadians are welcoming and accepting. And I hope that remains a part of the Canadian psyche. So I think talking long, but I agree with your point. I just am really curious what the issue would be that would continue to give life to the PPC.
I think it's completely going to be something unexpected. I think in 2019, we would have been having much of the same discussion, and we wouldn't have known that COVID-19 existed if we did this.
That's very true.
So,
yeah.
I don't know, maybe we'll be sitting here in 2024 and talking about some weird alien invasion, which is now the zeitgeist of their party. Finally, ending up this segment, nearing the end of this podcast, the election isn't here yet. What's your prediction?
I think that the Conservatives can lead the House in seats. I don't think they have a chance of getting a majority, but I think they can overtake the Liberals and have the highest seat count from this election. I think, I don't know much about polling in that, but I think that there will be an element of people. Trudeau did not accomplish everything that he said he would, and people will be looking for a change. And I think that will pull a little stronger for the Conservatives than maybe it's looking right now. That being said, I refuse to give up on an election before it's done. So if the polls were off by 15% in Liberal favor, I would still probably say that I hope. But I think neck and neck, there's a lot that can happen on election night, and there's still, even with recording this podcast, there's still a few days left before people go to the polls.
Yeah, no, it's anything can happen, right? That's why we love elections. But yeah, no, well, I'm interested to see how they do finish, and we'll see how big of a mess Canada's governance becomes if this stays this close.
Yes. I will say one of my favorite conservative quotes, kind of tongue-in-cheek, is a Russell Kirk quote where he says, "I am a conservative. Quite possibly I am on the losing side often, I think. Yet out of a curious perversity, I'd rather lose with Socrates than, say, win with Lenin." So whenever conservatives lose an election, I always remind myself of that.
Keep your head held high,
Exactly.
Well, talking about elections and losing, we're talking about the future now. And I want to
Mm-hmm.
finish this off by looking a little bit at what we think the future of the Conservative Party will be. And I know this is a bit presumptive of 4 days before an election to start talking about the future when the biggest event is 4 days away from us. But I just still wanted to ask you, I still think the election is a big turning point in the Conservative narrative that we're going to see have ramifications for the next 20, 30 years, maybe even.
Mm-hmm.
And I have two big fears about this. My first fear is that we've seen the Conservative Party lean left within their platforming, within their rhetoric, within their messaging under O'Toole. I'm scared that if they fail to form government, even by the smallest of margins, we'll see a significant swing back right, try to reclaim those PPC votes and rebuild what they had before this election came. And my second fear is simply that while support has been starting to spread out more across Canada for the Conservatives, there's still very large strongholds in Western Ontario, like Alberta. There's still got a lot of support from certain regions. And if they don't form government, we'll probably see significant kickback again from Alberta with the Alberta Out, or whatever sexy acronym they'll make up for that, narrative re-emerging and re-threatening our national unity. So what do you think of these concerns? Can you make me sleep better at night, Tony?
Yeah, I would say the first one, I'm not concerned about a swing to the far right. I think the past two leadership campaigns have shown that even after losing, conservatives are committed to a centrist, center right lean. And Maxime Bernier, Derek Sloan did not win leadership elections. Maxime Bernier was close, I will admit, but they went with candidates that stuck with the channel that they were in. And I think I still look over the conservative landscape, and even thinking the next 20, 30 years, I have faith in a lot of the conservative MPs and leadership within the party. Figures such as Pierre Poilievre, still Andrew Scheer, who is in the party, Michael Chong, who's probably one of my favorite MPs, Leslyn Lewis, and in my own riding, Carleen Hawley. I think those people embody some of the best of what I believe in and see in the Conservative Party. And I think that they will lead and continue to lead as they have done. Michael Chong is a great example of that. He has been in the Conservative Party since the Harper days and many different positions, but just a steady, consistent, polite force for the Conservatives. And I think those are the people that I look to, and that they'll continue to do their good work. Related to the second question, it's a hard one for me to answer. I have only ever lived in southwestern Ontario, and really southwestern Ontario, surpassed by only Toronto and Ottawa, is one of the most prosperous and well looked after regions of Canada. So I believe the dialogue needs to begin, no matter who wins this election. The dialogue needs to begin with that there isn't unity in politics across the country about issues, and then trying to find solutions that meet the majority and help the whole country. I think we're getting much better at doing this with certain groups. I see some of the changes with our First Nations and First People communities, that all of the parties are becoming much more attentive to listening and hearing from them before judgments are made or solutions are proposed. I think that similar attitude needs to be done for geographical disunity. So too often with an issue like, say, climate change in the West, the conversation starts with, how do we convince Albertans to do what we want about climate change? Or how do we convince them to give up the pipeline? And those are just questions that set the conversation off on a bad tone. Instead, it needs to begin with, why do the Western provinces see climate change so differently? When it comes to something in our own backyard, like vaccines, why are people worried about vaccines? Are vaccine mandates actually just when they apply to people who are unvaccinated? Do they live up to our ideals as Canadians? Because I know a lot of people who have very legitimate and reasonable concerns about vaccination, and especially, some of the debates about 12 and up, children 12 and up being vaccinated. I think that's a very contentious and topic that has a lot to discuss about. And this is one of the few times I'll kind of level criticism straight at someone. I think of all the leaders, Trudeau needs to stop his self-righteous attitude. I support him, and even as a Christian, I pray for him as our prime minister and want him to do the best. And I think part of that is he has a way of picking the majority and alienating the minority. And I think with his scandals and conflicts and some of his issues, even on the feminist side of things, I don't want him to like be canceled or removed. I just want a little more humility, just a little more working together and realizing that you can't demonize people who don't think the exact same as you.
Yeah, it's an interesting critique. For me, I don't know if I completely agree with referring to him having an attitude of self-righteousness. I think it's more the job is difficult. I think we underestimate. He's been in power for 6 years, and he is trying to hold on. He's leading a minority government, which hasn't really failed yet, which is impressive on its own. And that largely is by appealing to the majority Canadians. And I don't know. It's a good point, because I feel like it's important, especially in a nation like Canada with our Quebec French language minority. We can't really isolate minorities, and that's not an example that the Prime Minister should set. But then again, if we look at issues like COVID and the minorities who are anti-vaccine, perhaps the cost-benefit analysis that he's using says the majority is the thing I should be focusing on. But regardless, it's a complicated debate. I could do an entire debate-style episode on just that debate, and I don't want to, because that'll be hell for me to moderate.
No.
But
and again, I want to emphasize that my prayer and my hope is that whoever is elected prime minister, even if we have a crazy situation and Annamie Paul is our new prime minister, my hope and my prayer that they would rise to the occasion, that they would lead Canadians, that they would lead our nation well. So my criticisms of Trudeau are in the hope that if he is our next prime minister, as he has been in the past, that he would be the best for Canada.
Yeah, I think that's valid. I think it's one of the beauties of our rights and our democracies that we're allowed to criticize our leaders. So
yes,
I guess not ending on that kind of pessimistic note, I want to ask you, just to kind of summarize up this entire episode, do you think O'Toole has solidified himself as the Conservative leader throughout this election?
I think the Conservatives, until we win another election, it will be hard to call someone the Conservative leader, because they stand in the shadow of Stephen Harper, who is a titan of Conservative figurehead. Like, it's just crazy. That being said, I am impressed with O'Toole. Even though I disagree with him on some socially conservative issues, I think that he is a good and a right leader for this time. I think that he has challenged me to evaluate my views on things such as climate change, social programs, I was even in a town hall recently, and I was honestly challenged at his care and his heart for the Indigenous communities. Very easy here in southwestern Ontario, very removed from some of those challenges. But I heard the words and the emotions of a man who has seen it and cares about it and really wants those communities to succeed. And I think that has been a great look and a great challenge to Conservatives, who can get, our tendency is to get caught up in budget balancing, strong Canada, things like that, and we lose some of the compassion. So I think for sure if he wins this election, he will have accomplished a great thing. And as I've said before, even if he doesn't win the election as prime minister, I would love to see another round and a continuation of his leadership to see where he can continue to lead us.
Yeah, I think it's optimistic, but I don't think it's unreasonably optimistic. I think it's stability is what the Conservatives preach, and stability is what they're looking for. And O'Toole seems to be the path to it. I hope so.
I hope so.
Yeah. To round out this episode, I always finish on a personal question, which you're anticipating. I know we've been given an illustrious contract, Tony. You and I, we've been appointed as the interior designer of the man cave or woman cave of each of the federal party leaders. What one item are we ensuring is in their man cave?
Okay. So Trudeau is a massive Habs fan, from what I know. So we need to find the biggest, hugest Toronto Maple Leafs logo that we can plop in his man cave at Sussex Street. No, I think for him it would be easy. Set it up for hockey and for the Habs. I'm a Canadian. I don't watch a lot of hockey, but I support any Canadian team. Jagmeet Singh, I think he needs like that perfect social media setup because like where he can, like all the lighting and the couch to film some videos on, but then the computer and that, because man, no matter what happens, that TikTok channel is gold and it needs to keep going on.
Are you joining his Animal Crossing server?
If I had Animal Crossing, I would consider it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a reason he's trying to lower the voting age, but yeah. No, I could see that. He could do a nice like YouTuber style like setup.
We need to get him on Twitch. That's what we need to do.
Ooh, that'd be nice. I did hear that. I remember I was talking to Sav, and she watched the live stream he did where he was playing Among Us with AOC, and. He did join in that. I saw the tweet and I thought it was kind of begging to join in. But regardless, she said his personality is a little bit more working on to be like that live performer, but he'll get there. And he's getting a son, so if anything else, it'd be amazing to see him like play video games with like his child. Did I say his son or his child? He's getting a child. I don't know the gender.
I'm leaving Erin O'Toole until last. I'm going to be honest. I know very little about the Bloc Québécois leader. And anything I'm going to say is going to be stereotypically Quebec, or French, so we're just going to pass over that one. Annamie Paul, I think she's had it rough. I think it needs to be a room that's like dedicated to her accomplishments. I was so amazed to hear about the NGO international work that she's done. Just like photos and things that would represent all of her accomplishments so that when the Green Party gets a little rough and the federal council's, coming up behind her, taking her budget, that she can just go there and relax.
So what we're doing for her is flying her out to meet foreign leaders to get that picture and putting on her wall.
Exactly. Like just a collection of all this stuff. Maybe
that's a big mood push,
Yeah. And maybe like notable projects she's worked on. So, and then Erin O'Toole. I just think
my thought was getting a huge barbecue because he seems like the type who would thrive off like a barbecue setup.
Yeah.
But what
I was
were you
thinking like a classic, like kind of think like military bar, like where they have like a pool table and there's like mementos and pictures all over and you can get a good glass of scotch. I'd love to play like a game of pool or like darts with O'Toole.
I think he would beat all of us in darts, considering he's been in the military.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, well, I think that just about wraps it all together. Thank you for joining us, Tony. I think it's been a great episode kind of analyzing the terms. I hope this doesn't run too long. I think we're about an hour or so in, but if we set the record for the longest episode, I've heard people like the long ones, so we'll see.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Simon, for having me. And on behalf of many listeners, I appreciate this podcast. I appreciate the diversity of views and your commitment to hearing and inviting people like myself on. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. I just like hearing from different people, meeting new people. I know COVID's really locked us down, but being able to at least do some of this virtually and meet new faces, it's always been a pleasure. And if you're a listener too, and if you're listening and you're like, hey, why haven't I met Simon yet? Feel free to send me an email. I think the email's down in the description. If you want to be on, let me know. I'm doing our schedule for the next few days is pretty hectic. I know this episode, I might do a double upload the day this episode comes out because I'm also getting on the local candidate for my riding representing the Liberals, Karen Matthews, for Haldeman Norfolk. She's coming on to talk a bit about her experiences and who she is. And I think that'll be really interesting insight into what it is to run a campaign. And we're hopefully going to be posting that this weekend too. And then also this weekend, we're also going to do a final reflection on the campaigns. So if you're eager to listen a bit more to politics before the election day hits, stay tuned for that one. And then we're also going to do some election day content, hopefully. But afterwards, we should be doing some review episodes. If you want to be part of that, let me know. And yeah, I think that wraps it up. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review, leave a comment. And yeah, until next time, see you later.
Bye.